Hey folks, so today I want to talk about Writer's debugger and how you can debug through your particular projects. Before we get started, I'd like to go over the solution structure of this particular project here that we'll be debugging. So as you can see in the Solution Explorer over here on the left, we have a console application, we have a class library, which has our service class. Additionally, we have an ASP.NET Core web application. This is one of the default templates that comes with ASP.NET Core, and it is a web API project that returns random weather forecasts. Additionally, if we go down to the services window, I am connected to Docker. And here, let's connect to it. You can see all the projects we have, and we'll be using the MS SQL container here, which is actually connected to one of our databases. So if I was to shrink this window, we can look in the database tab, and we have a basics database with a people table. This isn't particularly important, but it's something we'll be using as we debug our project. So let's get started. We're going to go back to the console application, and there are multiple scenarios here that we can kind of set breakpoints. But the first thing to notice is there's this little bug icon up here. And if we can either click this or we could hit F5, and that would start debugging the project that's listed here in our run configuration. So if I was to click that, we would actually start debugging the console application. That said, we don't currently have any breakpoints. We can actually see all the breakpoints across our solution by opening the breakpoints window. Here we can enable disable breakpoints, which I'll show later. But we can also turn on CLR exceptions. We can also debug JavaScript through here and set JavaScript exceptions. I won't be showing that today, but this is a really important screen just to get an understanding. And I'll come back to this as we add more breakpoints. So one of the ways we can add breakpoints is go to a line and hit F9 or whatever key map you have. Additionally too, this section here, also known as the gutter, if we were to hover over certain sections, you can see a breakpoint icon appear. So let's go ahead and set some breakpoints. One of the nice things too about Writer is it understands that you want to set a breakpoint in a particular scope. The first two breakpoints that we set are not interesting. They are one-line scopes. But here on line 22, we actually have two scopes on one line. Each of these lambda methods is a scope. And if we were to put a breakpoint here, Writer would actually ask you, where do you want to put the breakpoint? I won't put a breakpoint, but you can see that it understands that there are two scopes here. The lambda expression in the where clause and the lambda expression in the select clause. I'll also put a breakpoint here on our person, and we'll see what happens when we start debugging. Also step through to this service method next. This method will just take a number and add 1 to it. Okay, great. Let's put some breakpoints here, which we'll come to later. And now we're ready to start debugging. So I'll hit this button. My project will build. Here we go. So now we're in our debugging session, and I'll close the Solution Explorer just so that we can see more of our IDE. This is the debugger window, and in general there are 3 columns. The first column is the call stack, and what I actually have right now is I have all external code hidden by clicking this Show All Frames. So if I was to click this, now we can also see methods that are called outside of our code. In this case, since it's a console application, you're seeing the .NET framework running the main methods. Additionally, too, we can see all the worker threads. So if I was to click this, you can see all the worker threads in our async program. Most of these are not really doing anything, but if you were doing more asynchronous code, you could see all the worker threads that are potentially performing actions. So let's hide that. The second pane here is our locals and our watches as well. So we can add a watch. Actually, let's step through. Oops, I think I stepped too far. But I think that's a good, we can kind of go back. Oh, no, we're still good. We've stepped into our service method, and now we have a value of 1. But this kind of shows some of the nice features around the debugger as well. We can actually automatically see the returned values from the previous method. So we don't have to add watches or have these things be locals. We can just kind of see it right in this window. Additionally, too, we can add watches. So if I wanted to know the value of 1 plus 1, we would know that it's 2. And you can kind of see this little calculator as well. If we didn't want to watch it, we can also evaluate any expression here. So here's a evaluate expression icon. And we can do the same thing as we do here. Right now we have watches and locals separated, but if you were to click this, you can collapse them into each other and separate them again. Let's go ahead and remove this. This isn't important for us. Another thing we should notice when we're debugging is the fact that Writer likes to show the values inlaid. So right now, as I step through, you can see that 1 is equal to 1. Let's go back to our service method, and we're going to do something that I think a lot of people normally want to do. So if we were to right click, we get this window of options. Enabled means the breakpoint is enabled, meaning we'll hit it. So we can disable that. Suspend means if we were to hit this breakpoint during our debugging session, that it would suspend the execution of our program. That's fine, but in some cases you don't want that. And if you were to uncheck that, you have many options to do other things rather than suspend. So we could log to the file system, or we can do all sorts of other things here as well. I'll keep that checked. Finally, we can also set conditions. So in this case, we can use the power of Writer and set conditions as to when we want to actually hit our breakpoint. You can see here we have access to autocomplete, so we have the full power of the IDE to write almost any C# expression that we want, and Writer, the condition in Writer will be respected. So yeah, okay. So let's go back to our program. We're going to step through. And you saw that we disabled the breakpoint. We're going to step through, and by the way, I'm stepping through by hitting F10, but consult your key maps. I'm going to step through. And one of the interesting things, let's scroll back up here. I mentioned inlay values. Inlay values work great for primitives, but for complex classes, you're left with something that's not really helpful. And one of the things you may want to do is come down here to the debugger window, and expanding our object, we can see all the properties in that person class. So we can actually go to the property, and you'll see this little flag here that you can click. And if we scroll back up, we can now see that that value, that age value, is being presented in the IDE. Cool stuff. So one of the other great features of Rider is its emphasis on parallel and asynchronous programming. So we're going to come back here and enable the breakpoint on our next method. And then we're going to go back to our program. And this particular block of code is going to attempt to call the next method in parallel. So let's go ahead and do that. And we've already hit this breakpoint, but seeing that it's in parallel, there are potentially other threads right now trying to execute the same code. In Rider, we can actually look at this parallel stacks window inside the debugger pane, and we can see where each thread is at and where it is in its execution. So if I was to click through, you can now see where the threads are at. You can see right now that there are 4 threads waiting to execute or leave the service.next method. And we can also see where those threads came from. So if I was to click this, the show all frames, you can see where everything is at. This is really a power tool for asynchronous programmers. I rarely use it, but it's important for those folks dealing with more complicated code. Okay, so let me go ahead and disable this breakpoint. I'm going to go back to program. So we'll put a breakpoint here. And I want to show you some of the other debugging features inside of Rider. They're not really part of the debugger itself, but they're debugging tools that many people can use when building line of business applications. In this case, we have a method that takes a connection string, creates a SQL connection, and then opens that SQL connection to execute a SQL command. As you can see here, our command text is actually syntax highlighted. This is one of the features of Rider that people find really powerful. I use this all the time. And what I've done is actually injected a language. So I can uninject it, and you see it goes back to a regular string. I can also select what language it is. In this case, it's SQL. Additionally, too, since we're connected to our basics database, I can just execute that SQL, and you can see the result here down in the services pane. One of the other nice features as well is we can edit the SQL fragment. So if we want different formatting, you can see it updating in real time inside of our code. We can also execute this same SQL. All right. So let's go ahead and step through this. Before we get too far, let's go back to our program. And we're going to step to this next method. It's called evil SQL. And let's look at it first. In this case, it's very similar to the method above, except for the fact that it's going to throw an exception, a SQL exception. So if I was to run this, I'll come back down here to the debugger pane. We'll hit the resume program button. And you can see that Rider actually broke on the exception. We can see the stack trace. We can use the stack trace explorer in Rider. And here we can see the line numbers from where the exception came from. So you can see we had our breakpoint. We never actually hit our breakpoint because it's on line 39. The exception occurred on line 38. Additionally, too, if we go to the debugger window, we can see this little lightning bolt, and we can see the stack trace of our exception. We can also dig down and see more information about our exception. And the same pinning feature that we saw in our previous example, we can do here as well with exceptions. So obviously our most important attribute of our exception is likely our message. So let's go back here. I'm going to step through and our application ends. So we have multiple projects here, and I've been working mostly within the first two projects, the console application and this class library. But I had mentioned that there's an ASP.NET Core Web API. If we were to go back to our console here, I have a method that's currently commented out. Let's step into it and see what it looks like. So the first thing we're going to notice is that we're creating an HTTP client. The base address is the address of our web API, and that we're going to call this weather forecast endpoint. To be able to debug the console and web application at the same time, we need to set up a compound run configuration. If we go up here to run configurations, we can see all of our run configurations in our project. We also have a compound, which I set up previously, but if you go here and add new configuration, scroll down, you'll see compound as an option. The amazing part of Rider is the fact that you can actually add multiple types of projects to your run configuration. So in this case, we could have launched a Docker image as part of our run configuration. And that's something that doesn't happen readily with other IDEs. We can also do other things as well, as you can see here. So we could run a node project, which is popular. We could run NPM scripts to do things like bundling and minification. So there's a lot of options here. In our case, we've created a compound run configuration that will run our web application and also run our console application. Okay, so let's go into our controller. I'm going to set a breakpoint here, but I'm actually going to first disable it. The reason for that is when this web project launches, it automatically hits this endpoint because that's the root endpoint. I'm going to put a breakpoint here, and only after this line is executed will we see ourselves hitting that breakpoint. So I come up here, I'll select our compound project, and I'll just run it. The thing to take note while debugging in Writer is that Writer will actually create a tab for each project. So you can see the web project and you can see our console application. Right now we've hit this breakpoint in our console application and we haven't made the call out to our web API. So let's go ahead and enable. And as you can see in this breakpoints window, we can see all of the breakpoints in our entire solution. We can see that our weather forecast controller is disabled. So I can go ahead and re-enable it. And I'll just hit done. And if I was to hit resume, we should hit that breakpoint, and we do. So you can see now we're in this environment. I can go ahead to the debugger. I can add a watch. So maybe I want to know what the random value is between 1 and 100. I can go ahead and look at that. I can remove that. And we're debugging right now in our web application. If I was to hit resume, we should go back to the console application and we see that our JSON value is set. So additionally too, now that we're running a multiple project debugging session, you'll notice that there's a little 2 up here on the stop button. We can actually choose to stop one or all of the projects that we're running right now. In this case, we're running 2 projects, so we can stop them all. But there are scenarios where you could have 3, 4, 5 projects running and selectively close each project down. So let's go ahead and stop that. So today we went over the basics of the Writer debugger, how we can set breakpoints, how we can configure those breakpoints, enable, disable them. We've also looked at the breakpoint menu to see all of the breakpoints within our solution. We've run a compound project to show how breakpoints work across an entire solution when multiple projects are being run. And we've also looked at SQL language injection in terms of strings and how we can execute those when connected to a database. The debugger inside of Writer is unique and special in so many ways, and I hope you've learned a little watching this video. So thank you, and come again.